So here's our JavaScript file for the Catch the Hacker game. This file isn't complete at this point. It simply lists everything that we know so far. The file is a little more complex than the last one that we just created, so we're going to go through it line by line. First, we are wrapping the entire thing in a closure. Now, this is not a requirement of OpenLayers. This is just good practice. By wrapping everything in a closure, we keep from polluting the global namespace. Next, we're defining these three global variables, global at least within our closure. First, we have a timer variable. This variable, as the name suggests, is going to keep a reference to our timer. The timer, obviously, is how we keep track of how much time is left in the game. Next, we have this ms_remaining variable, which is initialized at 60,000. Here, ms stands for milliseconds, so this is basically the variable that we're going to use to keep track of how much time is left. And finally, we have timerDiv. And this is actually just going to hold a reference to an element on the DOM. And we'll look at why we're doing this a little further on. Next, we come to this line, document.addEventListener DOM content loaded init. If you're familiar with jQuery, this may look more familiar to you if we were to write document.ready and call the init function. Basically what we're doing here is checking to see that everything on the page is loaded. As soon as the DOM is ready to go, we're going to call the init function. Speaking of the init function, that's up next. You can see in here, all it does is call three other functions: setupMap, initializeStartButton, and initializeTimer. setupMap should look pretty familiar. This code is almost exactly what we just wrote when we created our first map. First, we're creating a tile layer, which we are assigning to the variable StreetMapLayer. Our source is an OpenStreetMap source. Nothing new here. Next, we're creating a view. This looks slightly different from the way we did it last time, but it's in fact actually the exact same thing. The only difference is that instead of creating the transCoords variable, we're just doing the transformation from the EPSG 4326 or lat_lon values to the map projection, EPSG 3857, inline. And then finally, we're instantiating an ol.map object just like before. The only difference in this case is that our target's name is now map, whereas before it was myMap. Layers is again passed an array of a single layer, a street map layer, and then we're passing in the view. The next function is initializeTimer. Here we see a reference to the timerDiv I alluded to earlier. And all we're doing here is assigning the value of document.getElementById timer to the timerDiv variable. So I've jumped back over to our index.html file, and you can see here that the div timer is simply the div that's going to hold the number of seconds remaining. In other words, it's the div that displays the countdown. So why are we doing this simple assignment in a function by itself? Well, the answer to that is going to come in the startTimer function. So we'll answer that question in just a few seconds. But first, we're going to talk about the initializeStartButton function. In here, we're first getting a reference to the start element of the DOM, and we're assigning that to the startDiv variable. So here again in our index.html file, here you can see the div with the ID of start, and it's simply a container for the big green start section. So back in our JavaScript, we are taking that start div and we're adding an event listener to it. Specifically, we're adding the click event listener. And whenever the user clicks on it, this anonymous function is called, which does three things. It updates the quizDiv's display to block, which will make it visible. At the same time, it also changes the startDiv's display to none, to hide it. And then it starts a timer. So let's jump down to the startTimer function. Here, we are assigning timer to the return value of the setInterval function. The setInterval function in JavaScript simply creates a timer. The first argument is an anonymous function, and then the second argument is this value of 100, which is the interval in milliseconds that the anonymous function is called. So in other words, every 100 milliseconds, everything in that anonymous function will be executed. This continues indefinitely or until we clear the timer. So looking inside the anonymous function, we can see the first thing that we do is subtract 100 from the ms remaining. In other words, we're removing 100 milliseconds from the ms remaining total every 100 milliseconds, which makes sense. Next comes the reference to timer div again. And in here, all we're doing is setting the inner HTML property to be the value of ms remaining converted to seconds. That's what we're doing right here, taking ms remaining, dividing it by 1,000, converting it to a float, and then doing a little rounding on it. So I said earlier I would discuss why we used initialize timer to assign the value of document.getElementById timer to the timer div, and why we're using a global variable. Well, this is the reason why. Every time that timer fires, we're going to be updating the inner HTML property of the timer div. Now we could have included the document.getElementById timer code in the start timer anonymous function, but that would mean that every single time the timer tripped, we would have to go through document.getElementById to get a reference to timer before we could update its inner HTML. A more optimal method is to just call document.getElementById once and then simply use that reference every time the timer trips. And that's what we're doing. Then finally, in this anonymous function, we're checking to see if milliseconds remaining is 0. If it is, then we know time has run out, and we pop up an alert that says that the hacker has escaped. We also stop the timer at that point by calling clear interval and passing in the variable timer. The final function is the catch hacker function. Now this function will be called whenever the user actually catches the hacker. You can see this is fairly simple. All we're doing is stopping the timer by calling clear interval and passing in the timer variable, and then popping up another alert which says that you caught the hacker. Incidentally, now you can see why timer had to be a global variable, as we're referencing it in two other functions. So I mentioned earlier that this file is not yet complete. You may have noticed that even though we have a catch hacker function, we have no code which actually calls that function. In other words, right now, there is no way for somebody to win the game. So here's our page based on the code so far. We have a working map, and we're able to pan, zoom, everything that we knew we would be able to do because this is the exact same code as what we created earlier. We can also click our start button, which will start the timer and give us our clue. So far, so good. However, the one thing that we can't do is actually find the hacker. If we go ahead and zoom in all the way, here's the Tower of London. You'll see I'm zooming in, but no hacker is appearing. That makes sense, as we haven't included any of that code. And so that's what we're going to do in the next module. But first, we're going to have to learn a little bit about vector data types.